Okay, good evening. I hope everybody's doing well. I apologize for the lateness of this video post. Of course, anything's not due until tomorrow, but at the same time, I know a number of you are trying to get it done a little bit early, so my apologies. By late, I mean 9:30 my time. Just come on now, let's get done here. So this is for the class in 200. We're still talking about really our close reading essay that's due on Friday, that 1,000-word essay. There's two videos tonight, or two series of videos. They may go longer than two. The first one will deal with another poem that's about form and content and structure. So I'm going to look at one of those together that's going to be read for this evening for you. And then the other video that I'll be making will deal with some really basic outlining stuff, like what do I mean when I talk about topic sentences and transition sentences and thesis statements, and just some stuff that might be helpful to have. So as always, if you have any questions about anything, or if there's anything I can follow up on, or more content, or generally whatever you're looking for, please email me. I should say that I haven't really received any emails about anything like that. And if I have, today, if they came in after 5 p.m., I haven't had a chance to check them. So if you have content that you need or more questions answered, just let me know. Anyway, I want to get into the poem so I don't waste too much of your time. So here we go. We've got a poem here, and Day Brought Back My Night by Geoffrey. So I'm not really going to give you much background information on the poet because I don't really know much about Geoffrey at all, actually. I know he's contemporary. I know he's still writing. I've never really been super interested to find out more about him, so I don't really know what that means one way or the other, but I don't really care. I think the poem stands for itself, which is really what a close reading is supposed to do, also known as New Critical Thought, which is a capital N, capital C, New Criticism. A school of approaching literature by looking at just the literature and not looking at any of the time period in which it came out of or the history of the poet or anything like that. Just like, let's just look at the poem and see what it does. So there's some definite problems with that approach, but for this poem, I think it works pretty well. So before I look at the poem too closely, remember that we're thinking that form equals content, that content has something to say with form. So if that's not familiar to you yet, go back and check out that early first video with Elizabeth Bishop's One Art. But in many ways, this poem is similar to her work in that it is also in what we call a closed form or a received form. And by that, I mean that there is a particular series of rules that this poem is following that actually the visual of it tells me almost all of it that I need to know. And this is nothing that you should pick up on unless you've been studying poetry since I don't know, 2002 or whenever I started. I don't really remember now, but the idea here is that I can look at this poem and I see a few things. The first thing that I see here, I see 4 lines here, I see 4 lines here, I see a stanza break, then I see 3 lines, then I see 3 lines. Obviously, I also see 6, and I see 8, and a stanza break. But what I see here is what we call an octave. That's what, like an octet, actually, in poetry. A stanza that's 8 lines long is called an octet. And then a sestet, S-E-S-T-E-T, is a 6-line stanza. Typically, not always, but typically, if I have a poem that is only 14 lines long, which is the entirety of this poem, and the first one's in 8-line stanza, an octet, and the second one is 6-line stanza, a sestet, I know that I'm dealing with a sonnet, S-O-N-N-E-T, which actually translates into small song. These are traditionally love poems. This is an Italian sonnet form by the number of lines and where the stanza break happens. So the number of lines, if I start with 8 and I end with 6, then I have what we call an Italian sonnet, often sometimes referred to as a Petrarchan sonnet because he wrote so many of them. But basically, the love poem based on the Italian sonnet is that in the opening stanza here in the octet, there's going to be the development of a theme, typically a love, or pining over someone, depending on the kind of love. But it's almost always like romantic. Sometimes it can be spiritual, but romantic or erotic love often. And then we have a stanza break. There's a very particular word, for the stanza break here that I will mention in just a moment. I don't know why I'm building suspense on this very special word. The sestet following this is typically some kind of comment on the opening 8 lines. So I'm trying to think of the right words for it, but it would be like, here's somebody's original claim, and here's kind of like not really a counterclaim, but it's a commentary upon it. So this is a pretty old structure. There's a mini call and response is one way that maybe a little bit more familiar, but like case and study is another way to think about it. But generally, two different movements here. Now, the big surprise is, sorry, is this here, this here, it's pretty Texan of me. This break here is often called, or is called a volta, and that's a V-O-L-T-A, a volta. And sonnets have them, Italian sonnets have them here, in where the author here has made a very obvious break in the two stanzas. And a volta actually means a turn, right? I like to think of it in a more contemporary parlance, which is like, let's call it a twist, a plot twist. So the volta is the thing that tells me that I'm actually going to like have a different take on what I've already heard. So it's a bit of a physical, a visual cue as to what to expect with the poem. So that's a lot of information here. I know to go in with it is an understanding of a love poem. I understand that it is an Italian love poem. I understand that we're going to have a setup and a discussion about it in some sort of form. I don't know if he's going to really follow up with that before I read it, but I know that's the structure. So if he doesn't do that, then he's playing against it, and that's interesting. And if he does do that, then I want to see, what is he actually commenting on in that space. So that gives me a lot to work with, but because it's a sonnet, Italian sonnets have a very particular rhyme scheme, and that's because, because that's just the rules they have. But it's typically ABBA, ABBA, volta, CDE, CDE. And remember, when I use those letters, that would be the last word of each line, and that's how we denote what is the rhyme scheme. So ABBA, ABBA, CDE, CDE is an Italian sonnet. And you'll see this doubling of sounds in Italian and in French forms too, because it's slightly easier to rhyme in a Latinate language than it is in a language like English, which is a heavily Germanic and has taken from everything else along the way. So when I look at this here, though, I see that it's not actually in ABBA. If this was ABBA, the rhyme would say me, matter, matter, me. A dog, less, less, dog. That would be ABBA. But instead, this is ABAB, then a new sound, CD, CD, volta, EF, EF, G, G. And if you'll notice that like joys and days, so I pause there for a second, joys and days don't actually really rhyme. Work and back barely have anything in common, and then you and do is very full again. This rhyme scheme actually is an Elizabethan sonnet or a Shakespearean sonnet because he wrote so many of them. And this has a slightly different approach to your sonnet form. Typically in an Elizabethan sonnet, the opening 12 lines is the setup, and the final 2 lines is the comment. So the volta actually happens right before this in fact moment. So in this particular poem, what we have is a hybrid of 2 different kinds of sonnets. So it's just a lot of information. It's 8 minutes into this video now. So I just want to say that that's a bunch of information. And I know that information because I've spent the past 2 or 3 decades really working closely with poetry. And it's going to help me explain this poem to you, I hope, in a later video. But also, you're not supposed to know all this information, and you're not supposed to memorize all this information. What you need to note, though, I hope, is that what you can start to recognize is that if you have a 14-line poem, you are working in a sonnet structure. And if you're working in a sonnet structure, then the next thing to think about is like, well, what's the rhyme, right? If it's not rhyming, then it's playing against the sonnet structure, and that's interesting. How is it doing that? Why is it doing that? What's the content about? If it has a rhyme scheme, as this one does, then we can really think about that as a structure with this one. But because I have, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to yell. This is late for me. So because I have 2 different plot twists, 2 different voltas in here, one here, right, and then one here, I actually think that maybe twisting, right, turning ideas, or surprising me, for lack of a better word, it might be central to this poem. I don't know that for sure, but it seems like maybe it is. So I'll read the poem, and then in the next video, I'll break down a little bit of it, and your prompt will have something to do with finishing the poem. So this is, and Dave brought back my night. It was so simple, you came back to me and I was happy. Nothing seemed to matter but that. That you had gone away from me and lived for days with him, it didn't matter. That I had been left to care for our old dog and house alone couldn't have mattered less. On all this, you and I and our happy dog agreed. We slept, the world is worryless. I woke in the morning brimming with old joys till the fact checker showed up late for work and started in. Item, it's years, not days. Item, you had no dog. Item, she isn't back. In fact, she just remarried. And oh, yes, item, you left her. Remember? I did. I did. I do. Okay. So I'm going to end this here, and then I'll start a new one where I kind of go in a little bit more detail about everything that the poem is trying to accomplish. So this is the end. Thank you very much. I hope you're doing well. Yeah.